Welcome everybody. We are so pleased to be able to have this presentation with such a great audience. I'm Amy Ford. I'm the branch manager of the Lexington Park Library at St. Mary's County Library. And I am so pleased to welcome Historic Sotterley, our amazing partner in this project, working, to view this video and have this conversation about Sotterley's video, Walking and Talking Common Ground. So we're very grateful to Nancy Easterling and her team for putting it together and for being willing to be here and to be part of this conversation with descendants of Sotterley and how that reckoning is changing how museums and other sites are interpreting the story of enslavement and how it's changed America. So we're going to go ahead and get started with watching the film Walking and Talking Common Ground together. And after that, we will open up some discussion with the descendants that are here with us in the Zoom room today. And after that, we'll be able to entertain some questions from the audience as well. All right, now let me wrangle the tech and we'll get started with the video.
Cynthia, Carolyn, Maria, Henry, Anne, Martha, Eliza J, Charlotte Ann, Maria.
On one particular trip, I was here for the UNESCO International Day of Remembrance. And on that particular trip, I was to read the names of the former enslaved. And as I read the names, there came a point to where I thought I had just read the names of my second and third grandmothers. I didn't say anything to anybody about it for weeks. It took weeks before I would actually say anything to anyone about it, because I had to work through those feelings. And then, of course, I had to eventually tell what happened. And, because it's one thing to see those names on a slave schedule, because I had seen them on the slave schedules. But it's totally something different to read your ancestors' names on a wall on a plantation.
The work that is going on here, the descendants of slave owners and the descendants of slaves, if you can reach common ground, is a model for the nation.
Because Sotterley really is connected to a whole lot of people, whether they know it or not. People came here, people arrived on ships here, people were sold here. The property itself changed hands several times. So there are a whole lot of people who are connected to Sotterley, and they aren't even aware of it yet.
So we are part of Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project and the UNESCO Slave Route Site of Memory. So we remember those people that perished on the Middle Passage. So there's many people that didn't make the voyage. They died. There were 28 people or so that died of smallpox on the Generous Jenny and were thrown overboard, basically. And the rest landed here at Sotterley to be sold or to work for James Bowles or to be sold further south.
You get to come here and learn so much about both the enslaved and the enslavers. And it's also It's kind of peaceful, believe it or not. It's kind of peaceful, especially with the water being right on the Patuxent, and you get to walk around. And because knowing about slavery, you do have your emotional side. You know, one minute you're angry, the next you're not, and here you're able to work those things out. It's kind of therapeutic being here, as well as educational.
And my people that are living today, they are proud of our ancestors, the things that they did. And I'm lucky to be connected to Sotterley.
My great-grandfather, who was born a slave here, may have lived in this cabin or one very similar to it, because when he was born here, he was born a slave. The Board of Trustees invited me to join after my mother had served. So my mother and I talked about it, and I said, well, I don't know. She said, yeah, no, go ahead and do it. And I want you to go down there, and the only thing I want you to do is keep your eyes on that slave cabin. Do not let those folks tear that slave cabin down. And so here I am. I think the importance for her, and also for me, is that feeling of being connected. You know, we always hear other Americans, mostly white Americans, talk about, well, my grandmother's French and Irish, and my grandfather's German and Russian, and when they have these stories, and they can go back several generations. She could only go back to two, her father and her grandfather, who she only knew for a couple of years. But finding that he was born at a certain location, and now she could even imagine that he was even born in this cabin, made her immensely proud.
Growing up near Sotterley, as I did, I always knew that our family used to own Sotterley, but that was probably the extent of my knowledge. We didn't really talk about or even understand, the history in detail, such as that the family owned a large plantation with a large number of slaves. That wasn't really a part of the discussions, but as obviously research has been done, and when my father was the president of the board, or prior to that actually, and he met a descendant of our family's enslaved, Agnes King Callum. They came to be friends and collaborators on working to preserve Sotterley. To be the next generation doing that is incredibly powerful and impactful, I think. And people, when they realize that, and say how, really special and unique that is, it helps you evolve as a person to accept your history, the good and the bad. And it's a journey that my family and I are on, and other descendants. But it's been a very, rewarding and interesting process that we're still dealing with every day.
This weekend was totally incredible. From the Descendants panel with multiple descendants from California, Baltimore, here right in St. Mary's County, we were able to speak about the common ties that we have. You get to see the plethora of the emotions tied to things as we journey into the unknown. Some people are embarrassed by their history. I was always taught in school, if you look like me, your ancestors were slaves. Only thought about them working in the field because that's the only thing that we were really shared. We knew about Harriet Tubman, we knew about Frederick Douglass, and a few others, but we didn't know they contributed anything outside of field labor. So on the journey to discovering ancestry, you find out the actual contributions of the people who were enslaved, because they had a culture before they came here, and they brought that here. They brought those skill sets here and helped to build this community. And that's something that I wasn't taught in school. So therefore, there was no value in coming to Sotterley in 7th grade. But as a young adult coming back, I see great value. It took a few decades to heal, but learning and becoming aware that everybody's life journey is worth talking about. Everybody brings something to the table, and everybody has value. And the courage and strength that it took my ancestors to survive slavery, it's in my DNA.
I felt lucky to have known my maternal grandmother's parents, my great-grandparents, and they talked about their families all the time. And that was the one thing that I was grateful for because of a school project in 1987. Hey, let's do our family trees and let's present it to the class. So I began asking those hard questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? Who we're related to? Whereas my mom's generation and my aunts and uncles, some of their cousins, like, no, don't ask grandma and granddaddy those questions. That's very personal and private. And I was like, well, why not? It's just learning about history. Fast forward to the 21st century, we now have DNA testing. We now are realizing, oh my goodness, the people that grandma said was a different set. No, they're not a different set. They're the same set. We just weren't raised that we were family because it was always the narrative that's a different set. And so now DNA testing is proving, man, our family is much bigger than what we thought. And it's not just here in the United States. It's now across the Atlantic in various countries and on the other side of the world. And my cousin Jerome touched on that in his presentation. It's amazing at what pairing science with traditional documentation research, traditional mapping, taking a drive through the country, you begin to make connections, and it transcends the borders of what we know as race or ethnicity. It's about people. And if we connect with people, if we connect with the landscape, the possibilities are endless.
I connect to Sotterley through, of course, my people, the Blackstones and the Williamses. But I also connect to Sotterley through people like the Briscoes, people who have been here for almost 400 years, all the names that we know that go along with the Sotterley story.
I have a collage. One of the presentations I do, I have a collage of a number of my ancestors. And, you can look in their eyes, you can see the faces of these people, and you can only imagine what they must have gone through in 1900, in 1865, in 1730, or whatever era they were from, and what was going on in America at that time. When I look at those faces and they look back at me, what I see is those folks saying, Jerome, you can do some things that we couldn't do. You can go places we couldn't go. You can be things we couldn't be. We did what we could on our watch, and we want you to soar. We want you to expand and push this thing forward, and maybe nudge the next generations that come behind you to do even better than what you're doing. And so, to the extent that seeing those pictures of those ancestors, and having the sense that they ran their leg of the race, and now I got the baton in my hand, and there is an obligation to get around the track smartly.
Sotterley provides a tangible marker to gauge how far we've come and vividly illustrates that human social progress doesn't occur in the absence of sacrifice.
I look at the time that I've been here and the changes that I've seen. Certainly, bringing about having our tours changed and the training of the docents change was one of the integral pieces. But it's been across all these different parts of Sotterley, all these different programs, that these changes have been huge as they all add up together, creating living histories, the choice about Sotterley's War of 1812 story, redoing the tours and created new guided tours that were never part of our story, redoing our signage. Our Land, Lives, and Labor exhibit is incredible and really brings to life the stories of the people upon whose backs the site was built. And then the slave cabin. That exhibit and making it available for everybody who comes on site was such a major turning point. But so was the start of the Descendants project and absolutely the Common Ground initiative. These are about taking history and now bringing them into a context where we can talk about what history has brought us to today, and how maybe by talking about this, we can not only understand the past, but understand our present and start to move forward. And our descendants are leading the way on that front.
I call the program Common Ground because we have a shared history, and this programming brings us together, our stories, and have hard discussions about the legacy of slavery and how it affected our whole nation. Our Descendants project was formalized. We've always really had descendants here and there, active, but we decided in 2019 to formalize the Descendants project, and it's just really grown.
It's allowed healing across racial lines, and it's also allowed us to add multiple layers to the story of what our ancestors at Historic Sotterley, whether it was those who owned slaves or those who were enslaved, it's allowed us to add a much broader story for individuals to understand what life was like for those who lived and labored here during slavery and also post-emancipation.
The important thing about the history of Sotterley is that now you have people who can tell it so very well, who have studied it, who know it, who are the descendants of it. Makes a big difference when you're actually part of the land that you're talking about.
What I hope for Sotterley is that, of course, it can continue on the path it is on. So many strides have been made, so many accomplishments, that it has evolved from just a kind of a more narrowly focused old plantation to a very all-encompassing historic site and museum that tells stories that, are so compelling and inclusive, all the true stories that were very much hidden in years past. And I hope that we can continue on that trajectory. But of course, I hope that Sotterley can just continue just from a financial standpoint, a sustainability standpoint, because that's always been a challenge. And it'd be nice to be able to focus more on our mission and the great programming and education that we provide to the community, instead of having to worry about the realities of the funding, which we do presently. That would be my hope for the future.
I hope that Sotterley will become a place where every child, in particular, who wants to come and see what a working farm looks like from 400 years ago, can be welcomed here and can be told the truth about what happened here. Not some fantasy, some made-up tale, but the actual truth about the slaves, the free people, the owners, how they interacted, how they didn't interact, how they made it work, how they survived, especially how they survived.
Whether we like it or not, Sotterley is the place where life in America began for many of us. And it's also the place where I can say I truly walk in my ancestors' footsteps. So.
Well, thank you to everybody in our audience for joining us today and taking a look at this film. We are so fortunate because we have almost all of the descendants who are featured in the film here with us tonight to answer a couple of questions. So what I'd like to do is have everyone introduce themselves, and I'll just call on folks, and if you can just tell us a little bit about you and your connection to Sotterley. So Jerome, I've got you first here. If you would let us know a little bit about yourself.
Okay, sure. So I'm Jerome Spears, and I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. That's home. But I came to realize that I had ancestry 100 miles south in Southern Maryland, specifically St. Mary's County. And over time, we became familiar with a place called Historic Sotterley, and the fact that we had relatives that were on Sotterley Road and Valley Lee and in Leonardtown and other places in Southern Maryland. And so it didn't take long to start wanting to know more about my roots all the way down in Southern Maryland and start to figure that out. So I went from just knowing that the place existed to then realizing that the names like Stevens and Barber and Schreiber and Spears, and you could go on, so many names that resonate with this particular place tie into my family directly. And so as a descendant, we're working to kind of piece it together and make sense of it and go forward from there.
Thanks so much.
Sure.
Nancy, do you mind saying a little bit about your connection to Sotterley?
Yes, it has been my honor to serve as the executive director of Historic Sotterley since 2009. I've been at the site since 2005. And there's been incredible change during that time. I mean, the groundwork was laid, and as this film is dedicated to Agnes Kane Callum and John Hanson Briscoe, we had a foundation laid with those two that few sites in this nation have anything similar to that. And what has been happening over the past, particularly the past decade, has been a building on the teachings on that Agnes gave us. So much of this happened, and we've looked at this trajectory. So it's been my pleasure to serve on so many of the projects and be part of watching that transition since the time that I've been here. And it's been incredible. We have so much work to do. We're not even remotely done, but it is because of our descendants and their involvement that sets Sotterley very much apart from so many other places. And because we span 300 years, we don't just talk about one era. We have people from modern day that still are more modern times that still dealt with that legacy of slavery and that we're all still dealing with today that are part of that conversation. So it's been incredible to watch during my time here.
Thanks so much. And Martina, if you don't mind saying a little bit about your connection to Sotterley.
Yeah, I had to unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound good.
My connection to Sotterley goes back 45 years. When my mother started doing her research, I got volunteered, like they do in the Army, to work with her on her research, and you know, that's how I learned about Sotterley. And it's been a wonderful experience to watch something change, because early on when we first started going down to the site, you know, they had buildings, had a good storm come through, they would have been blown over, and you know, watch the development of the educational programs, and the Descendants idea, I just think is, you know, fabulous, because it gets away from just the owners of the property and this one family descendants of slaves, and it includes everybody, whether they were slaves or not. If you worked at Sotterley, you're a descendant.
Well, and Jan, maybe you could talk a little more about your connection to Sotterley too. Oh, sorry. Let me get your tech going there, Jan. Can you go ahead and click on that?
There you go. So again, I'm Jan Briscoe. I'm currently president of the Board of Trustees of Sotterley, and also a descendant of one of the families that actually owned Sotterley for a large part of the 1800s when it was a large plantation. And it is absolutely my honor and pleasure to serve on the board with other descendants, such as Gwen Bankins here and Martina, and and work with everybody on this panel also, and Merideth too. And it's just an honor to be a part of it.
Thanks. Angela, could you say a few words?
Hi, I'm Angela Wilson, and I first discovered Sotterley right as the slave cabin was being opened. I forgot what year that was, maybe around 2017 or so. And I had never heard of Sotterley before until I started doing research on my maternal grandmother's side of the family and found that her grandmother and great-grandmother had both been at Sotterley. She was a Lyles. They were Lyles.
Thank you. And Merideth, tell us a little bit about your connection as well.
Well, I'm thinking first of my connection to the film, but I did serve on the board at Sotterley for a decade. And during that time, there was a lot of change. But since that time, there's been even more change. And the film, I guess I can talk about a little bit. David Taylor of Focus Video and I did an introductory film, Introduction to the Site, which still plays in the visitor center, and that's been over a decade ago. And a lot, as I said, has happened. As Nancy said, the Descendants Project, the Common Ground Initiative, Growing for Good has all happened since that video was made. And so it was past time to update, talk about all the exciting things that are going on at Sotterley. So we were fortunate to be commissioned to tell that story. And so I am here largely because it was my task and my pleasure to try to tell that story in the film. So I go on. I will say that talking about telling the story, the biggest challenge I think was trying to tell two stories at once. The story of the organization of Sotterley itself and the changes, in particular the Descendants Project and the Common Ground Initiative, which have blossomed since I was actually off the board, I think more. And at the same time, to try to tell at least a little bit of the individual descendant stories. So, and maybe in a way there are three stories because we also shot most of the video during a conference, a 2-day conference at Sotterley. So that also was a way, had to be worked in as telling the story of that conference. And my challenge was too that I wanted to, rather than do a narration, and have the external voice coming in and explaining it all to you, sort of thing, to try to use the descendants' own voices and the staff of Sotterley to tell those stories. And it's actually would have been easier to just, kind of write the story and have a narrator read it. But much less interesting and less rewarding. And Amy, did we lose her?
I think we may have lost her.
I could talk some more.
Amy might be muted, so why don't we finish doing introductions? Dante, could you go
Dante.
ahead and introduce
That's a good
yourself,
idea.
please?
Good evening, everyone. Dante Eubanks. I was born outside of Maryland, but have lived here in Maryland since the 90s, and always knew, with my family that we had relatives, as they said, relatives in Maryland, but no one ever said that we were from Maryland. It was because of a research project. I interviewed my great-grandparents and started asking questions and learned. I live in Leonardtown, right in between Sotterley on the Patuxent side of the county and Newtown and Old Society Hill on the Potomac side, which is the Britton Bay area of the county. And it's interesting because that's where my mom's great-grandparents' ancestors, as a result of the Rousby family and the marriage coming over from Calvert into Sotterley, and then those being sold from Sotterley with the Plowden family to the Hammersley family here on the west side of the county. So it's interesting when you research your roots, but always happy to be a part, happy to be with this great group. They are definitely hard chargers and want to ensure that our story, our collective story, is remembered and told and shared.
Thank you, Dante. How about you, Gwen?
Hi, my name is Gwen Mikens. I am the Secretary of the Board, Chair of the Preservation, Restoration, and Interpretation, and I'm a descendant of the Kane family. I too have been associated with the site since the 40s, and to timestamp that for you, that's about the time that Roots came out. I was in 7th grade. Martina's mom tied our family to Historic Sotterley, which is within 15 minutes of my home. For me, not understanding the contributions of my ancestors, and it's not my history, it is American history that we are sharing today, telling the combined stories of those who owned the enslaved and the enslaved who lived and labored at Historic Sotterley. It is something that I was voluntold to go there the first time by my mom, and I was voluntold by Martina's mom that I was going to be involved after I got out of college. So I'm serving and I'm learning so much, because I think that people don't value life because they don't understand that they truly come from people who are a strong people. It takes a lot of courage and strength to survive the institution of slavery, and we don't often talk about the resiliency of those individuals. And as we learn about those who lived and labored and the contributions that they made to our community and to this country, we are very proud of our ancestors, as Agnes Kane Callum always said. And the beautiful thing about it is that Jan's dad and Agnes, I got to witness the brother-sister relationship between them to save a treasure like Historic Sotterley. Some people wanted to just remove the site because it shares a story of a time that history was not pretty. However, history should never be hidden. So we continue to discover, explore, and share our common heritage and history because we need to, and because we have to give voice to our ancestors. So I'm happy to be here and happy to serve.
Thanks so much for telling us a little bit about your connection to Sotterley. And so I'm curious, I think Angela touched on this in the video, that emotional journey that everybody has had to take as part of discovering yourself to be a descendant of Sotterley. Can you talk a little bit about what your emotional journey has been through your discoveries?
It changes. It doesn't stay consistent, it changes. You know, you're happy that you found the location where your ancestors were. And then at some point, you start to feel a little angry about it. You know, your feelings change, it's up and down. You're happy for a while, and then there are, you know, when you think about the realities of what happened, then you're not happy anymore. You know, it's up and down. It's constantly changed for me.
For me, it went from a point of anger as a child to learning that everyone has value and worth, and learning that they helped to build this country. That's great pride in our ancestors. I think the point where it really sets in that your ancestors were property, I think that is something that is always hard, that they didn't have. I mean, they basically had a price on their life, but it wasn't prices, it was a dollar amount, because they were basically an instrument of work. You know, think about the runaway slave ads. They described humans just like a piece of furniture that was lost. You know, that's hard to think that that could have been me so many years ago. But I thank God that our ancestors survived, and we know that because we're here. So the emotional journey, as Angela said, it can be all over the place based on where you are, what you're learning and what you're discovering, and also who you're connected to. Because the group of people that you see on the screen are just a small portion of the individuals. And I'm also speaking of those who ancestors enslaved us also. We have to never, never not give value to their life, because none of us were here during that time. And they also have a journey of understanding and anger and acceptance that they have to go. I can't separate my history from the individuals who owned me. It's not possible. So that's my journey.
Well, I'll just pipe in very quickly off of what Gwen said, which is that, you know, starting back when, again, Martina's mom and my dad back in the 90s, you know, this is before these things were done. They started the conversations. They started to show how we can tell these honest stories in a respectful way, without blaming anybody, making anybody feel bad, but just being honest about it. And they've paved the way for, you know, our generation. And so it's still been a journey, you know, certainly for me and my family. But, you know, fortunately, everyone has been welcoming and friendly. And, you know, you learn to respect other people's stories and listen. And it's been the most rewarding, but definitely challenging, you know, process.
I'll just add that, yeah, it can be kind of an up and down emotional roller coaster. And yet, you know, there's plus sides to having these sometimes difficult discussions. And sometimes you'll find when you have discussions and you collaborate with other people, they'll have pieces of your own family's puzzle that you don't have. And if we can kind of just get to the point where we're all trying to help each other, we all get further down the field as a result.
Also dealing with the emotional trauma that comes with realizing your family was broken apart so many times. You know, it's not even just Calvert County to St. Mary's County, but it's Maryland to Virginia, Virginia to places in the South like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And a lot of people, Angela touched on it in the film, is that a lot of people don't realize their connection to Sotterley because they're fixated on a locality. Some people might be fixated on the last owner before emancipation, the Briscoe surname, but not realizing it's the Briscoes, it's the Medleys, it's the Lyles, it's the Stevens, it's Bankins, it's Carter, it's Plowden, it's Plater, it's so many names, Brooks, it's Fenwicks, it's Barnes. There's so many different surnames that span so many different time periods and are the descendants of various ancestors that have been at Sotterley for generations, as well as went through several ownership changes. Being able to piece that together, to be able to find documentation, to piece that together is a daunting task. And it's not as easy as sitting in front of a computer and getting on Ancestry and putting in a name. Sometimes it takes a decade. It takes time, and then it takes having conversations with Agnes and asking questions, and then cousin Agnes saying, yeah, we're not talking about them butlers. We gonna leave them butlers alone, you know. But there's a reason why we didn't talk about the butlers. But you know, she made a joke of it in light of a difficult situation of researching family history. So it's that trauma, that it's an emotional weight that not only pulls at your heartstrings, but it's a daunting task that can take your energy to where sometimes you have to walk away and then come back to it at a later time.
And I'm just curious about some of those stories that were uncovered through the Descendants project. And, you know, so what are those new stories that you've been able to piece together, working together with other descendants? And, you know, what has it shown you about how Sotterley fits, you know, into the bigger picture in American history?
Can I comment on the last question?
Oh, of course, please do.
Yeah. It's when it's a painful history. You know, it really is a pain. And I was very fortunate to have such a dynamic person for a mother to help me work through, because she taught me that at this point in time in our life, it's the most important thing is documentation. It's documentation so that we save it for generations coming behind us, so that nobody can say this didn't happen. And that helped me, you know, over the years, definitely take away the sting of the reality that my great grandparents, you know, were enslaved and had a price ahead. Now on to you asked about some of the stories. You know, the beauty of the documentation is something as simple as looking at the census. If you go back and look at the census of 1870, you know, I was working in Warren, and you find out that your great grand whatever was a master plasterer who worked all over the county and did special projects and special jobs for people.
What other stories did you uncover?
I think the big story was I was trying to figure out how there were all these people in a location named Fonsdale, Alabama, that in the 1870 census, they were all listed as having been born in Maryland. And some of them had their elders that had been born, you know, 1790s, early 1800s, and their birthplace was listed as Maryland. And a lot of the common surnames at this particular place was Fenwick, was Plater, was Addison, was Taylor, Tayloe. But they just plopped down in Fonsdale, Alabama, in Marengo County, north of Mobile, and they're born in Maryland. And start looking at the documentation of, some of the other families. You realize when you're researching African American history, you have to research the European history as well. You have to do the community research and realize that these families in that area were the descendants of the Taylor and Addison and Harrison families, which were the great-grands and grandchildren of Rebecca Addison Bowles Plater, and her grands, and went from St. Mary's to Virginia, and one of them married a Collins out of North Carolina from the famous Josiah Collins family. And they picked up and took all of their enslaved with them from here and from the Virginia plantation, and went and bought Faunsdale in Alabama. But the only reason I knew that was because I was researching the Rousby family. But in just a common conversation one time, I had mentioned to Jeannie, I said, I would be very interested in getting more information on the families and their goings. I said, because I swear there's got to be a connection to the South. And Jeannie, she kind of laughed, but she said, well, Sotterley was a slave trade port to the South. And I was like, oh my gosh, so it's just having a conversation. It's having a conversation. And the more people you talk to, from different branches, from different areas, somebody has a small grain, but that small grain can lead to a compelling story, can open up the door and avenue to other discoveries. Just as Martina said, even just looking at the census, when you start looking at the entire community and not just your own individual family, you find other relationships, you find neighbors, you find people that are in the same trade. And you also see naming conventions, naming patterns where people are naming their children after one another. So all those clues play an important part. But I think the biggest thing through the community project was just having that conversation. And I think Jeannie and I were walking back up the hill, I think, from the slave cabin. I think I don't know if it was at the rededication or was it at the UNESCO event, but it was just a casual conversation. And it was like light bulb, but I would have never known that if it was not just having that conversation.
I think one of the things you also have to be prepared for is what DNA will reveal. Sometimes I know for me, it's like not knowing that when you're used to step grandparents and then you do your DNA and you find out you have other families out there that not by deleting the story, but just because life goes on, finding out that some of your ancestors may not look like you, and then because of the time, finding out whether it was a consensual relationship or not. And some of the other things is, yes, I was connected to Sotterley 40 some years ago, but it was like 2000 when I really understood who owned my family, which was my cousin Jan there on the screen. Her family owned my family, and I'm working with her dad and Jan in the community, not even knowing our histories were connected. We have that common tie. So for me, if Jan and I can have a discussion, acknowledge what happened and move forward, why do we have race issues in this country? We can get beyond some of the most egregious things and there's still unconditional love. We weren't there, but we have to move on, and then finding out I'm working with Dante and Kelsey over a decade in the community. And it's just like, oh my goodness, they're my cousin, Jerome. I thought Jerome was Jerome down the street until I met him at a Common Ground event. And it's just like, oh my God. And he unlocked so much history on my dad's side of the family. I mean, to find out fifth great grandfather in West Africa, it is amazing because you have so much to learn. And once you get bit by the bug, that's it. No sleep, always talking, always got your information. You know, Jerome and Dante are incredible with the work that they do and the willingness to share with anyone. Agnes and John Hanson set the tone for extended family. Everybody does not have the relationships that our descendants have at Historic Sotterley. Sometimes they're prickly relationships, but I feel we're trailblazers and showing the country that when you sit down and have a conversation, we can move beyond the ugly to get to what is important. And with Angela's like all over the place. You know, she is like up at the White Marsh, up at Sacred Heart, uncovering things that have yet to be, you know, logged into the book. So you have a group of descendants that are tied to a site, but yet we have those branches like on a tree that we're going, discovering, connecting. Jerome and I had the honor of being with 160 descendants from around the country at the African American Museum of History and Culture last week. And the journeys that people make, it shows that we've just started. I mean, we have a hell of a foundation, but wow, there is so much more work to be done. And what can we teach the children, those who are coming behind us? They have to learn their history. And Merideth helping to document our journey. We are so blessed for the work that she has done with Focus Video and our Land, Lives, and Labor exhibit. If you haven't been to Sotterley, you need to get to Sotterley to understand that it was once a working plantation, but we now are sharing history that is not in the books. So that's what I have.
I can share one discovery story, and maybe some have heard this before. My great-great-grandfather, Basil Bankins, was in Society Hill before moving to a place called Rosedale Manor, which was next door to Sotterley Plantation. And G.D. Purley used to do these great tutorials about this place that's been around for over 300 years. And the boundaries have changed over that period of time. It survived the War of 1812. It survived the Civil War. It's still here. So you've got that structure that survived all this American history. And so that's an incredible feat in and of itself. But the boundaries have changed. And so I was trying to find my Basil Bankins, and I knew he was in Rosedale Manor, which was near Sotterley. And as it turns out, the boundaries they expanded and contracted over all these 300 years, so that at one point, Rosedale Manor would have been part of Sotterley. It would have fallen inside of that large boundary that now makes it a neighbor. But so my folks, who I believe to be near Sotterley, were actually in Sotterley, probably around the same time. And we've got a lot of DNA connections that are flying all over the place. And that's probably part of the story that was still starting to unfold. Because if I look at this screen, I think I'm pretty much related to everybody that's looking back at me. And so we just got to kind of continue to work together and collaborate and piece the rest of the pieces together. But that's kind of the magic of just trying to dig into this, search for the truth, collaborate, help each other out, and then try to build a better situation going forward so that we don't repeat any mistakes that we probably could get around if we just thought about things a little smarter and did things with a little bit of more, collective, let's get through this type of a thing. So that's one comment that I'll share.
Any other stories that you discovered that you want to share? Oh, Angela, let me get your tech going there.
I've discovered, actually from going to Sotterley, I've discovered that I have a lot of work to do because they have Wilsons listed on the slave schedule. Wilsons are from Westmoreland County, so there's a story there. And then there are Barnes on the slave schedule. Barnes are from Tudor Hall. So it tells me I have a lot of research to do. I've learned a lot through working with Dante. And in fact, Dante had me read a book called The Autobiography of Reverend Thomas W. Henry, which I found out was my first cousin 6 times removed. He was raised a Catholic and went on to be a pastor in the AME church and did a great deal to keep the AME churches solvent. In addition, he was a friend of John Brown, the abolitionist, and he used to put little things in his sermon to encourage people to take the opportunity to escape when that time came, when that opportunity came.
Well, I know you've touched on this, and we'll bring out some other more stories as we talk too, but I know that you've touched on this, and tell us more about some of the common ground that you found with this, working with this project. I know it's, in lots of ways it's been challenging, in lots of ways it's been rewarding. Where are you finding the common ground overlap?
I think I'm pretty sure, I know Jan could speak to this as well. I think one of the greatest things, and Gwen touched on this a little bit also, as well as Martina, I think having 2 descendants here today, being, I say cousins Jan and cousins Martina, they are the next generation from their parents that are still carrying the torch that their parents lit in a time that was not the torch to carry. Let's just be honest. I believe cousin Agnes made it a point, and she did, she made it a point to involve everybody. And she did that at a time where there was no internet. There was no cell phones. There was no sending a text or sending an email or getting in a social media group. She did it hand and foot, snail mail, long distance phone bills, and taking the long drive. And I think the same can be said of Jan's father, to come to grips with, yes, this is a part of our family's history and we can't ignore it. We can't hide it. We have to own it, but align ourselves with the other descendants of those that were formerly enslaved and work together. So now that torch is coming forward, but it's also bringing everybody together from all the various descendant communities from the many years that Sotterley has been around, and the various generations and the touch points. And again, going back to what Angela said, is so many people have roots at Sotterley that still yet even realize it and realize how far back that root string goes. And it's also not even just about Sotterley and St. Mary's County, but it's about Sotterley extending beyond borders. And reaching as far west as California, far south as Louisiana, and even all the way around the world. Cousin Jerome is a DNA sleuth detective, and you just give him a DNA match and give him, a few hours, he gonna connect it and forward, backwards. Before you know, you got relatives in UK, you got folks in Australia, and he's so masterful with it that he's able to tell you to the chromosome level. And so all the many different gifts that are represented, even just on this screen, but the many cousins that we work with, often and in all the various projects that we're tied to, that common ground is that we're still standing on the giant's shoulders. And Jan and Martina are still carrying those bright torches together. And they're teaching us, the younger crew to, hey, come aboard, and because we gonna pass this torch whether or not y'all want it or not. We gonna pass it. And then you've got cousin Gwen that gonna send you an email, send you a text message, give you a phone call, and and she gonna apologize, but she gonna tell you she's still getting you the information. And then you got Angela that's coming to you in the messenger, text, email, chat, and she wants to make sure you're gonna be where the magic is happening. So I think that common ground is that the torchbearers that led the way, the fire is still burning, and we're not running out of fuel no time soon. And there's a lot of great work to be done. We're just scratching the surface. We really are. We're scratching the surface, and grateful for the technology that's helping us to even reach broader audience to get the Sotterley story told. And I think that's what makes our common ground unique, and to know that other places around the nation are taking notes from what we're doing at Sotterley, and that's something to be proud of.
Jan was muted, but when Dante was talking about how it's spreading, we've got over 200 self-identified descendants as part of this project right now. And let's be honest, 300 years, we've got thousands. We're just getting going. We're going to stick Jerome on this, and we're going to have them all over the place soon. But what I've seen when we're talking about common ground, because of what people are hearing from these voices you see on the screen, and from the work that's coming from the people that are working with us now on the screen, and so many other descendants, it's inspiring others to come and look at Sotterley. They don't know, a lot of people don't even have an idea where to start, where to get going, how to find their connections. But these stories are representative of a national story, of so many other stories, and they're being inspired by what they're seeing here and realizing, maybe I'm connected to here, maybe I'm connected somewhere else, but they're starting to understand there's a great interconnection. And there are so often, I am having the privilege of hearing of people telling, I didn't even know I was connected to this person. I mean, you've just heard it here on this screen. And it can be sometimes not always an easy thing, because sometimes it's going to be somebody who didn't look like you and you didn't know those connections were there. So that common ground can be sometimes challenging. And as Angela said, it can be an emotional roller coaster for everybody. But if you're willing to have the conversation, and willing to talk, which this group represents in an amazing way, it's the first critical step to be able to move forward together.
And Jan, I think you had a comment about that too.
Well, I was going to say, I can't improve on what Dante said so eloquently, but other than, we all share, I think a common goal that, yes, we want to learn about our own histories, but we also want to help to keep Sotterley open and preserved and supported, which, is a daunting thing with 90 acres and 20 historic structures that are constantly in need of TLC. And, that's a huge challenge that we all share, in caring about as part of what we're doing, so that we can, because there really is no substitute for actually going to a place like Sotterley and seeing with your own eyes, a real place where real things happened. It's not just reading a textbook or something. It's real, it's authentic. So I think we all also share in that goal to try to keep the place, keep it open and preserved for future generations.
And I think that was, that educational mission is really central to the Sotterley story. And one of our audiences asked, what would you say to families who don't want the real history, the true stories taught in school. Does anybody have a comment on that?
Well, I would say that it's history. It is American history. It is the story of how our country was built by both African Americans and European. It is history, isn't it? And it is everyone's history.
Yeah, the native part, all of it.
Exactly.
You just can't leave any part out.
Mhm.
If you try to slice and dice it in a way where, you know, you've made it, you've skewed it one way or the other, you're doing it at the disadvantage of so many other people who also played a role. So we need to be comprehensive and full and transparent and complete and tell the story. If we tell it in that way and you know, just lay it out there. And if you need to explain some of the context of the time and what else was happening that could contribute to how you got from A to B, you can certainly do that as you're telling it, and then you can then try to figure out ways to then go, so here's what we need to do now, and then you create that critical bridging element so that you've laid it out what happened, you've explained it why it happened, and then you've also then followed right behind it with what needs to happen now so that collectively we can all move down the road together. That's, I think, how you're going to do this in a way that's going to be productive.
I think I'm going to say, I think Trudy says in her interview something about you're making the choice to let your child live in fantasy, because the alternative to learning about truth and actually what happened is to live in fantasy. And I really think that's, it may sound attractive, but it is dangerous.
Yeah, I tried, can you hear me? I was trying to send a written response to that very question. You know, the first thing that comes to my mind is, why would you want your child to have an incomplete education? Because it would definitely be incomplete if you don't include the history of slavery. And, you know, people have to learn, you know, we're not bringing the kids in, accusing them of anything, but really arming them with information so that this sort of thing is not repeated again, you know, in future. Germany had a similar problem shortly after the Second World War, where, you know, the Germans were walking around, some Germans were saying things like the Holocaust didn't happen, you know, and they had photographs. And some people, when the camps were liberated, some villages were forced to go to the camp to see the camps while the people were still there. And they would still say it didn't happen. So it must be taught. It absolutely must be taught. You know, we're probably going to wind up just like we are in this country with these two crazy political systems, you know, half and half believe and the other half don't. So we got to make sure the teachable are taught. There are people who don't.
I think it's not only about, it's about the things that were left out of the books, the things that they've rewritten history. We also have to think about, I'm a minister, so I'm also going to say about faith. This country was also founded on religious freedom. So we look at the leaders and the way that this country was founded, we're leaving that out as well. So it's like they're taking all the things out that were important when this country was built. Maybe that's why our country is falling apart, because we're not dealing with truths, you know? So maybe if we start dealing with truth, we can give somebody, it's like fake stuff has no foundation. It's not gonna last. You know, why is it that Sotterley Plantation is still there with all of the extreme weather that we've had, and so many places have been destroyed? I personally think it's a higher power, and I believe that it's there because history needs to be examined, looked at, and shared. And if we don't learn from our history, we're going to repeat our history. Modern day slavery, whether it is um, sex trading or the human trafficking, it doesn't make a difference. We're still treating humans as property. So when are we going to wake up and start dealing with the truth head on? This feel-good history, it doesn't exist. Every day, even what we go through, we can look back at our ancestors and see how strong they are. Maybe we'll get strength from what we went through and the way they built this country. We have technology, but what about the fact that when we didn't have technology, how did we survive? Our history is a strong and rich history, good, bad, ugly, indifferent. And that's what we need to deal with, not feel good names of what happened. It is what it is.
And so through this film and this storytelling process, what questions did you want to answer in the film, and how did you decide that what was going to go in it? I know a lot of that was Meredith's role. What got left out of, I know a lot of stories, a lot of work went into it, and it has to be focused. But what did you accomplish in the telling, and what do you still wish you could have said?
Well, I guess I have to say something about that. It was very, very difficult. I had many hours of wonderful interviews, and I mean, these people were incredible to interview. And so it was it took a very long time and was extremely difficult to extract a few things and put it together. But so I had time pressure. So I started off with asking people, I had a few key questions that I asked everyone, and then I tailored other questions to each particular person from what I knew about them. And but I really had to, the goals were to be able to give people some understanding of what the Common Ground Initiative was, and what the Descendants Project was. And so, I mean, just that alone, and to give people a chance to meet some of the descendants, and as a fairly diverse range of descendants, but also to have the staff, Sotterley staff, talk a little bit about their perspectives. And Jeannie Pirtle, who was fundamental in developing those two programs, was an important person to have in it. I wasn't able to, the stories that you've heard that people are talking about, there was no way. For instance, Jerome is the recognized DNA guru, and there was no way that we could include really very much of that. And as you hear Dante talk about his family, it expands over time and space, and these people don't talk in sound bites. None of them. They have a great deal of very valuable things to say. So really, it was just trying to look at what told the basic building blocks of the story, and then giving a sense of who, of the basic questions I asked, who to choose, whose words to choose to answer that particular question, and just finding, they're different. I mean, it was really fortunate because I did know them a little bit. I met some of them I know pretty well, and I knew Sotterley very, very well. And I also had, when you're doing the story like this, a lot of it is finding images. When you're doing film, you have to find a lot of images. And so I had done the other films for Sotterley and interviews, and I was able to sort of cannibalize those. So it's just like creating a puzzle and and putting together the pieces. But I know I left out a lot of the wisdom and the experiences that people had. It was crucial to have Martina talk about her mother, and it was crucial to have Jan talk about her father. And because otherwise we wouldn't appreciate the fact that those two are still carrying those torches, as somebody said. So, and Angela was just amazing in being able to share her perspective so freely and her feelings about it. And they all were. They were just open and willing to share. So that was great. But I hope someday that some of that other footage will be able to be used. So that's my perspective.
Well, you know, we were, when I say we, I'm talking about the folks at Sotterley. The audience may not know this, but, I also served on the board. We were very fortunate to have you do the film, because you have been a board member. I mean, you've been hanging around the place for a long time.
Yeah, hanging around, yes.
Yeah, so you knew a lot about Sotterley, and you watched Sotterley, I won't say change, but grow.
Yes.
Grow, yeah. So we were fortunate to have you, not some random director producer coming in telling a story about a slave cabin in a manor house.
Yeah,
more to tell.
Deeply involved. And got to know your mother as well. So
that's a very good point, Martina, and I echo those words. I was honored. Meredith just came up to me after an event and was like, "Hey, we're doing interviews. Would like to interview you." And I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, right now." Oh, okay. It was, but I think it was. I think the fortunate thing is, even though a lot of things probably got left out, and Meredith said it, a lot of things did, but I think when you watch the video, I know I watched it multiple times, and I was captivated by Angela's opening. I was captivated by the two torchbearers, Jan and Martina. I was captivated by cousins Gwen and cousins Jerome and Trudy. And then at the end, captivated again by Angela's words and Trudy's words. So the daunting task, wow, to even have the hindsight, Meredith, to take all of us from the East Coast to the West Coast, we all live in different places, to take all of us and then navigate that footage. I can only imagine the feelings you may have had. Is this person going to feel bad that part didn't get included? Is this person going to think, oh, that's the part I really wanted included? But what came out of it is a phenomenal project, and it captures a vast net of descendants representing multiple different family lines, and yet all of us are connected, some multiple different ways, but you capture the essence of one, Sotterley, two, common ground, three, all of us working together, and each of us has a unique and individual story, but all of our stories have a common ground, Sotterley.
Wow.
Well said, cuz, I think Meredith has spent enough time at Sotterley that she knows that when you spend time at Sotterley, it's something that gets in your spirit and your soul. So when she has the visions for the videos, they touch your heart because it comes from the heart. And I thank you for giving voice to our ancestors and giving us the opportunity to speak and walk on the grounds that our ancestors once could not walk on, but also for people to see through our eyes what it's like to be the strength of those who came before us, for us to be able to speak for them. That's something that a lot of people never have the opportunity to do. So I'm honored that you felt that our stories were worthy to be shared. And I'm honored that you were able to put them together so that they flowed just like they're supposed to. We're connected. Jan and I did a thing for Asbury. It's beyond color. It's the power of connection, and that's Sotterley. That's our common ground. We are family. That's it. We're family. No matter how you chop it up, cut it, spin it, we're there. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
There was never anybody for this project but Meredith. Either she was doing it or I wasn't doing it. Just so you guys know.
Well, so to me, I also feel like Sotterley's story has a lot to tell the rest of the country. I mean, because it's not that this story is. I mean, we may have particularly talented people to focus on, but this story is just reflects a story multiplied by hundreds, if not thousands, of other places. And I mean, most of them are not in a situation where they can tell that story. But and it's great that Sotterley is, and that Sotterley still exists. But I do think I also wanted to not leave out the fact that there is a certain amount of fragility in terms of what Jan said. And that was sort of a question in her interview. Well, should we talk about the fact that Sotterley has, is dependent on for its survival on funding? And I'm curious about how the descendants, how they feel about that, and how they may approach the future of Sotterley's financial survival, which is difficult, as Jan said, even though there are tremendous supporters. So it would be interesting to know how the Descendants Project can feed that sustenance, that survival.
The one thing I do want to mention is that while we are all talking about our enslaved ancestors and during that time, Sotterley is very unique because we have the descendants that were there post-emancipation. The fact that Donald Barber, our Sotterley trustee emeritus, lived and grew up on Sotterley, that makes us so unique that his family was there, and he can tell us, through his eyes as a child and as an adult, he has seen Sotterley go through the decades. And I think that is something that also makes us very original, and I know that you'll be seeing an interview pop up from him a little bit later, but the fact that we can tell those stories before, during, and after slavery. So it is American history at Historic Sotterley, and that history needs to be preserved, and, through donations, through grants. My thing is, if you're not sure, come and visit, and you see that it's an investment in preserving the story, the one that should not be hidden.
One of the things that has kind of come out of this conversation is how much the stories emerging from Sotterley and the way that the Descendants Project, the Common Ground Project, are approaching this story, how much it's impacting other historic sites around the country. I know that that several of you were involved at the Smithsonian event last week. So if you could tell us a little bit about that and about how the Common Ground Project's connecting to the new National Heritage Area, to the African American Museum. I think we'd love to hear more about that impact that Sotterley has.
Well, I can speak briefly about that whole adventure. I think folks were brought from all around the country into Washington at the Smithsonian to try to talk about historic sites, physical structures, and also cemeteries and things of that nature that are around the country that in some cases are already in bad shape, or in some cases they're threatening to be in bad shape if left
abandoned or if attention is not drawn to them. And so this conference was designed to bring together a lot of the stakeholders around the country and get in one space to talk about some of the issues, to find out what we all had in common, what might be unique or different, what strategies might work across the board, exchanging emails, phone numbers, and things of that nature so that we could get stronger going down the road because we know each other now and we can connect to each other and combine our energy to try to be a more focused voice in trying to save some of these places. And so that was just a tremendous undertaking that the African American Museum and others took on. And for some of our folks here in the Maryland area, representing places like Sotterley and Susquehanna Plantation and other places in Southern Maryland, to be asked to be part of that was just incredible. So that just gives you some idea that what happens in Maryland. I mean, we were one of the original 13 colonies. And so if we're talking about national remedies, it'd be tough leaving out Virginia. It'd be tough leaving out Maryland and almost any discussion you have as you try to get broader and wider across the country with remedies and solutions and things of that nature. So we're kind of in a magical place here and we need to appreciate it and preserve it.
I think I was there with Cousin Jerome and with Dr. Ford. I think as far as Tri-County, we were the only ones from the Tri-County area, but Riversdale was there and a few other sites in PG County and, Maryland, DC, to have individuals share their story. And it helps you to have a resource of individuals. All of us are doing different things. So it's like to strengthen that voice, it's just like there's a couple sites that use the graveyards to help bring kids into the fact of telling stories differently. That discovery part of going to the graveyards to find out who people were. There was one site in Washington, D.C., and I can't remember the private school, but it was some young African American kids. I think there were 6 or 7, Jerome, and there was a young girl who was killed. She wasn't born a slave, but she was 6 or 7 when she died. And those children took items that belonged to them to put there for that young girl. That was so moving to see that. So it's like, you can't say we can't tell the history because our children won't understand. They felt a point of connection. Some of the graveyards that are supposed to be protected that are not protected, but yet the larger sites are being protected and they're connected to them. It's like we have resources from 160 individuals that were there of telling our narrative differently through music, through skits, all different types of way that they share, how the American history was. And so when we may find a roadblock of we don't know how to do it, we now have a connection to someone who does. And I know at the point that we did the libation, the second morning that we were there, it was so powerful to sit in that reflective room, to hear the water just streaming down and looking at the quotes around the wall and having people empowered with the fact that we're here to give voice to those who came before us that could not voice simple things because that could have meant their life. So like Jerome said, it was extremely powerful. I know that it was just a beginning. They do plan on expanding it. I don't know about him, but it's still hard for me to download everything we got last week. It was just incredible when you hear the stories. You can't help from not wanting to be more involved. Everybody knows the story of Kunta Kinte and that Alex Haley shared, but when Chris Haley shows the exit in Virginia of where he knows his relative's graveyard is, it's on private property, but yet he can't access it. It just shows us history should be accessible, that he could find that part, just so many stories. And just knowing that there's funds out there to help strengthen our sites, knowing that people care. I'm speechless with everything that we learned. I don't know about Jerome, but yeah, it was an incredible experience, and I'm honored that I was able to participate.
I know we've talked a little bit about, how Sotterley is leading the way. How is Sotterley showing other sites how to do this work? What kinds of other organizations are looking to Sotterley as a model?
Well, some of us, Gwen, Jerome, another descendant that lives in New Orleans, were invited to speak at a American Alliance of Museums conference in Boston last spring. And that's the kind of interest, there is out there in the museum world for what we're doing. And it was just, very inspiring to know other people, really do admire and aspire to do what we are doing. So it's definitely, the word is out there.
I know I was, talking about common ground and connections in genealogy projects, so kind of all rolled up in one. Was contacted last year by another genealogist, cousin buddy, Dr. Shelley Murphy, who's heavily involved with UVA and the descendants of the enslaved workers that helped build UVA and the surrounding communities. And she contacted me because there was a family that a family member that had attended her presentation that was just getting involved with trying to research their family history, and they had St. Mary's County roots. And so she contacted me, and we got on a Zoom with this family, and their last name is Thomas. And so they had several relatives from 3 different generations, and they started talking about Deep Falls. And Deep Falls is another well-known plantation here in St. Mary's County. And I jumped on the screen and I was like, oh, because they're Thomas descendants. I said, but you're Briscoe descendants. And their ancestor, Jeanette Briscoe, married a Thomas. And so there is a, plantation connection between Deep Falls and Sotterley, but working with them, and they're stepping forward in their family to bring forth the complete story of Deep Falls. Not just the story of the Thomas family and the Brooks and the McCubans, but bring forth the total, complete story. And so I didn't realize that, they had came for a visit. One of their eldest relatives had passed, and she was laid to rest at Deep Falls, and they wanted to meet in person. And they actually met up with their cousin, Jan Briscoe, and they got to meet with her early in the day, and I met with them later in the day. But it's the same conversation that we're having here. They're trying to navigate the waters of how to tell the complete story of Deep Falls, involve the descendant community of those formerly enslaved at Deep Falls. And so, sharing with them some of the things that, we're doing with Sotterley and some of the activities we're involved with that, as we've discussed, that transcends the borders. They're just now, scratching that surface. And, I know one of the questions in the chat was, is there resistance from, white descendants, and, how do you grapple with that? And there's not everybody in the Thomas family is about openness and sharing, but this branch, which are Thomases and Briscoes, they are, and they're ensuring that the story is told and told correctly, and that the history is shared, because it's a shared history. So I think that's that's a positive to know that another local plantation, but yet another same type setting to where they want to ensure that they include and involve everybody. I think that's another champion of the torchbearers that began this great work decades ago.
I know Riversdale House in PG County. Angela's been there with me as well as my mom and Michelle Young, another descendant. And being able to sit with their descendants as they're trying to tell the story. Sotterley went through that transition when they went from talking about the slaves to the enslaved. And, you know, sometimes people don't want to hear that story. So we have descendants at other sites that are trying to figure out, how do I do it right? And it's really, there is no right way or wrong way. We just have to do it. We have to speak, we have to discover, we have to explore, but most importantly, we must be connected to other sites because this work is not meant to be done alone. You know, again, it's American history. So they all existed during the same time. We all have similar stories. So I think there's strength in the fact that we are willing to connect to other sites. We are willing to assist descendant communities with maybe how to reveal that truth, but also how do we have a great education team. Our education coordinator, Catherine Humphreys, is incredible, along with Jeannie Purtle when Jeannie was here, as far as sharing this story with kids, Title I schools, elementary schools, where they may not get that history. So I wish that when I was that age that I would have been able to hear the history, because maybe I wouldn't have been so angry about why I was brought here when I felt there was no history to be shared here. So the power of connection, you know, and discovery and connecting to people with strengths that we're all walking the same path. We just have different exits, but we're connected because it's America.
So beyond our, you talked some about the connections between, you know, other sites. Are there other sites, you know, in Maryland, or are there other sites across the country that you can think of in particular that are connected to the Sotterley story? Even further afield, maybe, than Maryland?
There's the Thibodeau plantation in Louisiana that some of the Plater descendants are a part of that history, and then the French family, the Thibodeaus in Louisiana, got to because of a descendant call that we had a couple of years ago, had an offline discussion with one of the Plater family members. And so they actually put me in touch with a few folks in the area. And that was golden. And because it's again, you know, crossing borders and also working together, you know, to be able to navigate, you know, these waters that are difficult. Not everybody wants to have, you know, the conversation. Not everybody wants to talk about this history, but it is so important. And for me to know the full story of my formerly enslaved ancestors, I have to know the story of the enslavers. I have to know their story. How did they get to where they were? How did they acquire the land? What, you know, I have to know their story to fully know my story. So it's a shared history. And I think that's a great thing, that here we are in Maryland and there's a Louisiana connection, and we're able to extend that connection to other areas across the nation. It's just it's an awesome thing. And for such a time as this, in a world where we're still trying to navigate hatred and bias, we can find something that we can work through for the greater good, because it is important to me, and I want to leave a legacy and a narrative for the next generations. You know, I'm a grandparent now, so I look at things completely different, even from being a parent. So, you know, now I'm trying to get my children to understand the importance, because now two of my children have children. So I'm doing my own work within my own boundaries to work through that. But I think it's a blessing to have that connection to another site, another state, and that door was open through another common Sotterley descendant.
Cousin Jerome was being very modest. When it comes to Georgetown 272, that's the contact right there. Angela and myself and him have been on sites with when they're doing the archaeological digs, so it's like when we're still researching that site, you have people that are at the Jesuit sites, whether it be Newtown Neck or whether it be in St. Inigo's or anywhere else that are tied to Sotterley. So you talk about the plantations that are being connected, we're researching that, but also I have Native American in my history. And so, when we have the Piscataway clan tribe and when we have other individuals who are coming, there is many layers to this story. Dr. Julia King has done some amazing research on the Native Americans and Chaptico Manor and just getting connected. I know the Akakeek Foundation in Prince George's County has a lot of Native American history, but it's like we cannot leave any stone unturned, because we really don't know how we're connected or what we're connected to, because the story is still being written, and that's just the truth of it.
I'll just add that, and Jeannie, when she used to do her tutorials, she would talk about all the marriages that would take place. And sometimes you've got people marrying up and marrying down and marrying sideways and all that sort of thing. And some of those marriages involve folks that ended up at Georgetown. I remember there was a few letters that were written back to Sotterley from somebody. We'd have to pull Jeannie up and get her to give the details. But yeah, these tentacles go up, down, left, right, all over the country, emanating from a place that's been in one location for over 300 years and is still there. There's magic to that. And there's an importance to that. It's not a historic site for no reason, So that's just something that we all need to keep in mind and try to make sure it's still around for another 300 years by people doing what they need to do.
I know there was, you've talked a lot about DNA research and how much that science has added to the story and our understanding of Sotterley. Can you tell us a little bit more about this science that has advanced on
just real quick, because the whole DNA thing could be a little lengthy. So the quick version is that, if people are interested in getting their DNA into the various testing platforms where the scientists among us can compare, can contrast, can look at the various chromosomes, can figure out who's related to whom. And the science is there now where we literally can begin to figure out a lot of this stuff, figuring out with some accuracy and detail. And so we shouldn't squander this window where we have the capability to do this. I'll just say that. And yes, we've been able to go to places like West Africa. We've been able to go with DNA confirmation into Europe. We've been able to go into Australia with some of these confirmed DNA hits that the science is telling us. And so it's a magical window to be in. We're kind of on the front end of it. And there's a lot more that can be garnered from this research. The more people get their tests in the system, the more we'll be able to figure out.
Yeah, and I'm gonna steal Cousin Gwen's statement. Cousin Jerome is being very modest because he is the DNA guru. I wish I had just a portion of his mind and how he can process that much information. But then he and several other cousins say they wish they could have my history and how I've pieced together all the various family branches through the years, but we work together. But I can say with the DNA, and I know Martina's gonna laugh at this, but with the DNA, we're learning that Golfs and Butlers and Fenwicks and Prices and Somervilles are so tongue-tied that I understand better when cousin Agnes said we're not going to talk about them Butlers, because there was just so many. You knew family connections because that was the history passed down, but now DNA has blown up to where friendship circles. Gwen mentioned that. Gwen and I and cousin Kelsey, we've been on different things through the years, and then DNA pops up and you're like, oh, okay. I think it's this side. And then you come to learn, oh no, it's on this side. Oh, okay. But it's a powerful tool. And Amy, maybe you should do a whole presentation with cousin Jerome, because he will blow your mind with DNA.
I would definitely say that we need to speak to those who are older than us when it comes to DNA, because like the story between Dante and I had to get my mother to translate because I couldn't understand. I'm related to Dante. We're related on our mother's and father's side, so it's like, that's DNA. You don't know the story until you know the story. And that's Jerome's his golden gift is the way he can teach us DNA in layman's term to understand how we can allow it to empower us as we tell our story, because you look at it on Ancestry or 23andMe or any place else, and it's like, yeah, we see it. And, whether we're doing on GEDmatch or whatever, he has the patience to walk you through and get that DNA deposited. And then I'm just like, he said, well, what do you know? I don't know, because you haven't taught me what to do next. We got it where it needs to get what we need to get, but we still have to walk it through. So it is something that is not to be taken lightly. It is something that the accuracy of it has been incredible with the family ties and even the unknown ties that I've gotten. It's like working with people on the side of my family that I didn't know was the side of my family for 20 to 30 years. And it's just like, now I have to go back and find out, who is this person that connected us? Well, people have to be willing to share information. So just like when we're telling the history and people are resistant to tell it, sometimes people feel that you're coming in for other reasons to understand stories. So we come in peace. We just want to know our history. We want to know our family. So DNA allows us to do that, Native American and otherwise. There's a lot of work to be done.
I think also too, to piggyback that, cousin Gwen, Amy, I think one of the things DNA has also done is, so you've got all of us on here that are connected to Sotterley, some of us connected to Georgetown and Jesuit enslavement. And then you've got huge locations, places like Baltimore. Oh my God, I think we're related to everybody in Baltimore. I think we're related to everybody in Philadelphia, Allentown, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, folks all the way in Florida, people in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and even as far west as places like Oklahoma, Utah, Washington State, Alaska, and then again, I go back to cousin Jerome has made significant strides in connecting not only St. Mary's County with, Great Britain, but St. Mary's, Great Britain connected to Australia. That's huge. So, DNA did that. And, we can follow a paper trail, but DNA also is proving some of the paper trails. Yep, they not worth the paper they printed on, but DNA don't lie. And that's the powerful thing there. And being able to try to navigate, how are we related to all these people in the middle of nowhere, Texas, but they've been in the middle of nowhere, Texas, as far back as they can remember. How are all these people here in Maryland connected to them? So DNA introduces you to a whole new research mechanism, a whole new rabbit hole, and may present some brick wall challenges that we try to work through, in working groups and seeing if we can find some some details in the paper trail that may point to, oh, maybe this is how they got there. And then the other thing is all of us on here realize is sometimes you have to step outside what we tend to follow is surnames and follow the DNA. Because the DNA don't lie. You related. You may have to ignore the surnames and just look at the DNA connections and figure out, okay, somehow our entire branch of one family with one surname and an entire branch of this other family with a different surname completely related. DNA is telling us we're related. We just have two different surnames. So there's that, but it's good, bad, right, wrong, indifferent, and it's a wonderful journey.
Well, we're coming to the end of our conversation shortly because we didn't want to keep everybody too long. But is there anything that has really spoken to you about this conversation or a conversation that you want to carry on forward at Sotterley?
I think the transition, for one, knowing that my great grandfather was enslaved for 40 some years, and in 13 years he was free, but he stayed at Sotterley. That transition and post emancipation, that part is not that it's not talked about, but we need to really put the pieces together. Why did the enslaved stay so close? Was it out of loyalty, or was it because, of course, I'm a slave on Sunday, I'm free on Monday, I have nothing to help my family survive. We don't talk about that transition, and then, those tenant farmers that were there, Mr. Scriber, that there are so many families whose story is not told. We focus on that. There was Sotterley before slavery, there was Sotterley with slavery, there's Sotterley after slavery, and there's Sotterley today. And I think we have to remember that we're telling the whole story, and that 300-year history needs to be told, and it has value, and it's not something that we can just write away. It's something we need to make sure that it is there. So that's what I want to see told, and more about the skill set and more from the enslaved perspective. We share stories about the enslaved, but what is a day like in the life of the enslaved? The skills. We have to think about it. Let's talk about the manor house. Okay, they had to build a manor house. Lowe's and 84 lumber wasn't there. Okay, so how did they go about building that manor house? That is a skill set that still exists today that many people take for granted, but the ability to be able to do that from a tree. There are old school carpenters, there are historic carpenters. We need to look at that. We really need to look at how we preserve history and how this place came to be, but also how we sustain it. So the entire journey. But we also cannot forget about the farming, and I'm going to say that I feel part of the healing is our growing for good, which gives back. You talk about land that was once labored by my ancestors, now is labored, and this food is going to individuals who have food inequities. That is incredible. And I'm so honored that our site does that, over I mean, thousands of pounds. I can't even remember the last count, Nancy would have to say, but to know that through the years, Joe Goldsmith, our property manager, I call him a miracle worker, making things stay together, making things work. We have a complete story, environmental, agriculture, the people, the lives, the trade on the Chesapeake, 100 years of a steamboat. There's a lot. Why did people come to Sotterley? How did people go through Sotterley? Why did people stay? Why did people leave? We've only started telling our stories. So Merideth, I guess you're going to be busy.
I guess I'll also just add that this, and it's been touched on briefly perhaps before, but the folks that are on this screen right now, there are a lot of other places around the country that are struggling to try to get where this place already is. Now, we're not all the way where we need to be yet. And I think in the chat, somebody said is there resistance and so forth. So you're going to get some of that. But to the degree that people are working to say, hey, you know, we can beat our head against the wall until we all have cuts and bruises, or we can leave the wall alone, put our hands together, and try to help each other over the wall collectively so we all get to a better place. And we're working to try to go there. And there's a lot of folks that haven't gotten this far, and there's a lot of places around the country that are actually working to not get there at all still, regrettably. So to the degree that this is a model that the country can maybe help to use to build on, that puts us in pretty good position to help be that the tip of the spear, if you will.
Nancy, did you want to talk a little bit about future endeavors for Sotterley telling this story?
Oh, there's, you know, it was mentioned, there's so much work still to do. I mean, there were more exhibits we want to have, more programs. I think we want to keep expanding our Descendants project, because the more we expand this, the more the messaging is heard, the more that people are being part of these conversations. And I can't guarantee that sometimes they're not going to be uncomfortable. We're not trying to make them uncomfortable, but when you have a reality, when your reality is shifted because you're hearing things you just didn't know about, as Angela so aptly put it, our American history. It's our history. It's everybody's history. And as we learn more about that, as we go on this journey together, as people realize you're welcome to this conversation with us. And no matter where you are in your journey, come and join us in our journey. So with the leadership that you see here, and with so many other Descendants who aren't on the screen that are helping with this, I think we're going to come up with more impactful programs, more ways to connect, not only when they come to Sotterley, but ways that we can interconnect with other sites to amplify this message, which is a national message and a national story. But with the meat on the bones from all the stories that you've heard here and so many more, they personify our collective history. And I'm hoping to continue to amplify that message, not only on site, but far beyond.
Thank you all so much for coming to be a part of this discussion and enriching our understanding of the stories that Sotterley can share and the impact that telling this story and working together has on so many places around the country. We do have other questions we didn't get a chance to answer, but I'm going to share those questions with all of our panelists, our Descendants of Sotterley. We can see if we can answer some other questions. We do plan to send out additional information to everybody who registered. I know some folks didn't get a chance to make it here today. And let you know about more events, like the April 29th event at St. Mary's College of Maryland. It's going to be a screening of the movie Descendant, and a lot of the folks here are going to be involved in that project. And folks are going to keep telling this story. So you'll hear a lot more from us. We recorded this session. We'll be sending it out and, helping Sotterley tell this story. So thanks so much for coming to be a part of this. And we're really honored that you spent this time together with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you, Amy.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Have a great night.
Thank you.